According to an ancient Native American legend that I just made up, one day a copy of Go was traveling the world, encountered a copy of blackjack, the two fell in love, and from that love a child called Haven was born. Haven is a game that is reminiscent of some of the mechanics of Go and blackjack or similar games, in the sense that there is a board and you will be fighting for control of certain areas, trying to encircle certain areas, reminiscent of Go, and then also there is another part of the game in which you're trying to achieve as high as possible, a number as high as possible within a certain range without going bust. These two elements are used to depict a sort of archetypical struggle between nature and technology. Here you have a player that controls the forest and the other player controls the city, which is a sort of steampunkish civilization, and then trying to expand their influence on the board. To do so, they're using, however, a mechanic, again, that is reminiscent, that is mathematical in nature and has to do with achieving a certain total on another side of the board, actually next to the board. The game is for 2 players only, published by Red Raven, and without further ado, let me show you how it works. The game is played on this board here and also next to it, as you will see in a little bit. The players sit on the opposite edges of the board. A player controls the forces of the forest, the other player controls the city. Each player has 3 decks of cards that are used for different things. And then the board is divided in different regions, different havens that are circumscribed by paths, and paths have shrines on them. Then you have these 3 game pieces representing different elementals, the one for leaves, water and stone, and they're placed kind of on the edges of the board at the beginning of the game. Now, as I said, the game is also played next to the board, in particular around these 3 stacks of tokens. You shuffle them separately at the beginning of the game, face down, and then you flip one face up. The one that is on top and is visible, and has its number visible, is the one that the players are fighting for currently. Now, this is for a general overview of the components and things that you will use in the game. You start your turn by taking 2 actions, and these actions will involve your cards. You will have a hand of cards that will come from these 3 decks. You have a deck of Seeker cards. The Seekers are the cards that will allow you to take control of those tokens. And that was not supposed to be there, so you will have Seekers, and then you will have these cards that are called Offerings, and the Offerings are used to trigger confrontations with the enemy, and you may also have cards from this other deck which are special powers. So at the beginning of your turn you take 2 actions, and an action can be to play a Seeker to one of these 3 stacks. You will place your Seekers on this side of the board, so the forest on this side and the city player on that side. Now you can play Seekers from your hand, in which case you select one of the 3 locations and you place them face down. You may also play Seekers directly from the Seekers deck that you see up there, in which case you announce the place where you're going to place a Seeker and you reveal it and you place it there. You cannot look at the Seeker before you put it there. So you get it directly from deck, but alas, you don't know exactly what you're gonna get, and so you get what you get and don't get upset. So at the beginning of your turn, you have 2 actions. An action can be to place a Seeker, again from hand, face down, or from deck, face up. For an action, you can actually remove a Seeker and discard it if you don't like the Seeker that you have there. For an action, you can also play one of these cards, the power cards, and in each case you simply do what the card says. Different of these cards will give you different powers and different abilities. So you start by taking 2 actions. Then you will draw 2 cards, and you can draw them from any deck, so you can have different combinations of Seekers, Offerings, and or power tokens, with one important thing: you need to have at least an offering in hand. So usually if you don't have it, you'll just draw and you will add it to your hand. Unless you draw an elemental, in which case you had to play it immediately, which is you play it next to the corresponding stack. Stone elemental, we play it next to the stone stack. Usually we do that behind the seekers. By the way, that means that after a while you may have a situation like this, as in fact players play different seekers in different areas, and offerings will also be piled up here. Later in the turn, in fact, what you also will do is to play an offering to one of the locations. You must play an offering towards the end of your turn. And so, for example, I can choose, if these are in my hand, I can choose at the end of my turn, or towards the end of my turn, to play that offering there. Or maybe instead I want to play this offering here. So basically, these elementals are important because you can control them. You can control how many offerings are around an area. Why is this important? Because, back to us, remember, you perform 2 actions, you drew 2 cards, and if at this point there is a location, one of these stacks, that has 3 offerings total, putting together both sides of the stack, then you resolve that stack. So basically that is when the confrontation between the seekers occurs. In this case, we have in fact 3 offerings, 1 here and 2 there. Then we need to resolve this one here. Now, before we even get there, that means and this is a nice play area that you have. That means that usually, since you place your offering towards the end of the turn, then you place, say, the 3rd card, the one that will trigger a confrontation. The confrontation will actually then take place during your opponent's turn. After the opponent takes 2 actions and draws 2 cards, then you get to the resolve. So usually, well, it can be a disadvantage because the opponent will have 2 actions to manipulate things to try to improve their situation there. This is also why the elementals are important, because remember, they come out in this phase here, and you can control them. So actually that may be the situation, and my opponent is like, well, I have a full turn before I improve my situation there, but then this comes out. And so sometimes the confrontation will happen during the turn of the player that triggers it because of that. So there is that interesting element. In a confrontation, when we resolve the stack of tokens with a confrontation, because there are 3 offerings, what happens is we have 2 phases. Well, first there is one important element. We check if the total numbers of one of the sides exceed the value of the token. So if somebody had, for example, 8 points total, the player would go bust, would discard all cards, and would lose the following 2 phases of the confrontation. That's very rare because, well, you're trying to prevent that as much as you can. So after you check that people did not go bust, you had 2 phases of a confrontation. First, a combat, in which case the players will total their weapons. The forest uses arrows, and the city uses swords. You total all of the weapons on your side, in this case 1 versus 1. If there is a tie, player with the most cards. If there still is a tie, then the city wins combat. The player that wins combat gets to place, in this case it would be this player here, because city here breaks ties by having 2 cards. The player gets to place one of their shrines on the board in the location corresponding to that type, basically where the elemental of that type is. The city has 1 stone, so we go back to the board, we find the stone elemental, and the winner gets to place one of their shrines there. The loser gets to reposition the elemental. Second phase of the confrontation, after we resolve combat, we check lore. This time, instead of looking at the weapons, we look at the actual numbers, and the player with the highest total will get to take this token and place it in their play area. It is a tie, player with the most cards. If there is a tie again, this time is the forest that wins ties. But this confrontation is really bad for the forest player. The forest player loses that one, and the city also wins this token. After that, players discard all of the cards that they have around there. They discard their seekers, they discard their offerings. And if you lost both phases of a confrontation, well, at least you get to keep a card there. That is what would happen to the forest player there. So this is the general idea. Your turn, perform 2 actions, which is pretty much to play a card or to manipulate the cards that you have around here by adding or removing. Then you draw 2 cards, and that may trigger a resolution. You resolve any area that has, any of these 3 areas that has 3 offerings, and then you place an offering, mandatory whether you like it or not, and then end of turn, and you check to see if if a victory condition occurs, if a triggering the end of the game condition occurs. Now, as for this area here, you place tokens on it, as we saw when you win a confrontation. If you have controlled the majority of shrines around a haven, around a region, you get to place one of your control tokens there. So these are very, very important. Oh, so here the city would also get to place one there now. And so this is how it works. Now, because shrines are placed there when the elementals, after confrontation you place a shrine and the elemental moves, there may be a time where there are no places to move an elemental. At the end of that turn, the end of the game is triggered. The end of the game is also triggered when one of these 3 stacks is exhausted, is emptied. At that point, you count victory points. You see the value of the tokens so that the players control. For each category, water, leaves, and stones, the player with the highest value will get a card. The player that has most points on their water tokens will get this card here that is worth 3 victory points. And the same for the player with the most value on stone tokens and leaf tokens. The player that controls the most havens will get this card, which is worth 5 victory points. Then you have shrines are worth a victory point each. Lore tokens are worth a victory point each. And you total all points from all possible sources. And at that point, the player with the highest total is the winner of the game. So at the beginning I was a little bit worried that the game would feel like 2 games next to each other, which physically looks that way. However, then the 2 parts of the game felt integrated quite well. In truth, the main game, what really feels like what's taking the lion's share, is the part that is next to the board. The game feels mainly like a card game with these 3 sections, these 3 fields in which you're fighting and creating your sets of cards. And then, of course, what happens on the board is also very important. But what happens on the board mainly feels like a magnified scoring system. It is fun that if you win a battle and you place the token, your shrine exactly where you want it, the loser gets to reposition the elemental, deciding where the next battle will happen, trying to prevent you from creating patterns that will allow you to encircle havens. By saying that that is to me, the secondary element, I'm not trying to devaluate it. It is still a fun element, but I think actually it is good that the game is not perfectly split between these 2 things. Then it may feel a little confusing, but it really feels like it's a card game which is about hand management, it's about budgeting risk, it's about creating powerful combos, and it has also that secondary element. I don't mind that hierarchy. Actually, I think it makes the game feel like it feel more cohesive. And so what feels to me like the main element, which is figuring out what to do with your cards or where to send them, etc., works really well. In a sense, I would almost say within that, I really like that there is such a important element in deciding the decks that you draw from. That actually to me is probably the game, the most interesting, the biggest tension that you have. Because you will want a lot of Seekers and you will want a lot of powers. Those offerings are boring or silly. Whoa, I don't want them, boo-hoo. However, you have to play an offering at the end of each round, want it or not. And if you only have one offering in your hand, that is where you're forced to play. Maybe the offering that you have in your hand is exactly where you want it to, but you may have an offering that goes in an area that you do not want to trigger yet. So now I have a draw from the offering deck, hoping that I don't have to get that one. Maybe I get a similar card. The point is that on one hand you want Seekers, but if you get a lot of Seekers, get a lot of good points, you don't have a lot of agency about when and where the confrontation is going to be triggered. If you get a lot of chance of where to trigger it, you don't have many places where you're strong. So that catch-22 is very good. A lot of good games, in fact, they're interesting precisely because of the catch-22 element, because there's no easy path, there's no winning strategy. It's all about each time you have to decide what to do, and for each plus that you embrace, that you get to enjoy, there is a minus that you have to deal with later. And again, the first couple of times, couple of turns or rounds that we played, it seems that the player that triggers the confrontation always loses, but with those elementals that will trigger the confrontation randomly, you have that element of uncertainty, which again makes drawing from the offering decks pretty exciting. Other times you have such a strong advantage that the opponent simply gives up there and starts building somewhere else. There's also that interesting element. You have to choose your battles and choose when it is time to cut your losses and go and do something else in another areas. So, the game has a very strong personality in the sense that, although again maybe reminiscent of some mechanics, this blend of mechanics that are well known, I hadn't seen it before. It felt very fresh. On the other hand, precisely because it does not look like many other games, some of its mechanics are a little counterintuitive, and in particular the turn structure feels a little bit laborious. I played with a friend, and at the end of the first game, the friend was still like, wait a second, exactly, where does the offering happen? When do we trigger this? It's a unique script, which is unusual, it had its own flavor, personality, there isn't much knowledge that you can pour from somewhere else. So it may feel a bit laborious as you learn how to play it before you really grok the structure, before you really figure out how it goes, and feels natural enough that then you can exploit the timing of the actions to your advantage. So, while the game is not complex at all, it's not complicated at all, gameplay is complex, but that is good, strategy is complex, but that is good, but the game is not complicated, simply it may be a while before, to use a metaphor that has to do with the theme, before you see the forest, you see all of these trees representing individual rules and mechanics, and after a while you see the forest, something clicks in your mind, and now you're actually truly playing the game, enjoying the design. And when that happens, well, that's good, because the design has, in fact, many things that you can enjoy. Limited resources, opportunity cost, very interesting decisions that come from the fact that you want to do a lot of things, and you don't have the resources, you don't have the actions, so you always have to prioritize. Excitement that comes from the fact that you can only control to a degree when certain things will happen, and then there's even a push of luck. I want to be strong here and here, but I don't know exactly which one will hit, so I'm gonna invest on this one, hoping that I still have time to invest on that other two, instead of, say, investing a little bit in both. So there are really a lot of interesting decisions that come from the game, from the mechanics. The components are very beautiful, production values are very high. So in general, Haven is a really strong game. 2 players only, so maybe that's gonna be a little bit of a limitation for some players, but you have a game which has a very strong personality, doesn't feel much like other games, a lot of other games that I played. So very original, very inventive, and most importantly, fun to play. Haven by Red Raven. Pretty good game, strong design.